Hi. So let's jump into chapter one. In this chapter, the author gives a pretty big overview, really trying to introduce the topics. What are the key themes? What are the key perspectives that we're taking as we go about this process? And it's a pretty brief chapter. So the so what I'm going to do for these videos is I'm actually going to share my screen, um, and I will, I think my video, sorry about this, will be just in the top right corner, and hopefully this will work well. So the chapter one, again, it actually starts with the philosophical. And it points out that the study of learning didn't begin. It's been the question of how do we know, how do we learn, how do we come to understand the world around us. It began as a question not of psychology, but actually of philosophy. So philosophers have been interested in this topic of how do we know what we know for thousands of years, since antiquity. And philosophers, of course, didn't have experimental methods, didn't know much about neurobiology, but they did come up with some interesting ideas about mental life. And I do think that helps kind of frame where psychology starts. Of course, psychology is a much more new discipline, only been around for about 150 years. And the philosophy of learning is it's called epistemology. It's a question, how can we come to know things and be certain of what we know? And the epistemology has the root, of course, the ology is the study of, and episteme is knowledge. And so it's the study of knowledge. And a key figure to know would be Aristotle. Aristotle was trying to think about how do we know the world around us. And Aristotle is a very empirical person, which means that he's very oriented towards our experience and our actual interaction with the world around us. And so he came up with this idea that whatever's out there in the world, that we don't actually know the world directly. What happens is that we receive a copy of the world. And that sounds kind of abstract, but it might help to think about it in a different way. And that is, you probably know that you have five senses, and you have sight, touch, smell, taste, hearing. And so when you think about those senses, we have a world around us, but we're not actually experiencing that world. What we're experiencing is sensations and perceptions. What we're actually experiencing is chemical reactions occurring in our brain. So whatever it is out there in the world, whatever exists visually and spatially, and the vibrations, we are coming to know it in a particular way. We are, it's coming to our eyes, and it is being processed by our visual field within our brain, and our brain is constructing it. When we hear something, when we pick up vibrations in our ears, we are experiencing those vibrations as a, sound, of course, and yet we know from optical illusions and other things like that. The dress, you probably remember the blue or gold dress, that sometimes our perceptions of the world aren't actually entirely accurate, or they're subject to disagreement. So that's really what Aristotle was saying, is that we don't actually know the world directly. We're knowing our perception, we're knowing our copy. And Aristotle added to that and actually believed that the educated person, when they look around at reality around them, the educated person actually knows it more clearly. They've asked tough questions. They've thought about themselves. They've thought about these interesting questions of knowledge. So I kind of like that as an educated person, and hopefully as you're getting your education, that you can realize that when you look around at the world around you, having an education does shape the perception. You see things differently, you process them differently, because again, the same brain that knows the content, that knows interesting information about psychology, about the higher education we're receiving, it also knows. It also experiences sensations and perceptions, and so that same brain is going to perceive the world a little bit differently as a result of your education. So I think that's a nice thought. And this idea that we are, if all we have are copies, if we're experiencing our copies, then how do we know if reality actually even exists? And this is sort of a matrix. I don't know if you guys saw the Matrix series. It's a question that kind of gets posed there. It's this question of like, is it possible that what we think is reality actually only exists in our minds? That's an idea called idealism. It's this notion that maybe we're all in a sort of dream state, that when we think we are experiencing the world around us, maybe we're actually fantasizing. We're creating this whole complicated, you know, interesting experience. But maybe, well, in the Matrix, we're actually in these little tubes. Our physical bodies are in these tubes, and again, we're just creating the world around us. And so that could be. It's kind of hard to disprove that. How do we prove that we're actually experiencing? When I knock on this table, how do I know that the table is actually there when all I experience is the neurochemical firing in my brain? Okay, so that's a bit of a cynical and again, that's the idealistic. And then the other position is that everything is physical, that the world in its entirety is actually only material, that there is no supernatural, that there really actually is no mind. And so in this position, this is actually what many actually many scientists believe, is that the only things that matter about the world around us is the physical and the material. So those are kind of polar opposites, and some people are maybe a little bit more in the middle. And then connected to that idea is, of course, how does the physical world intersect with our mind? And so I've already mentioned that sensations move from our material body, and we experience things neurochemically. But if we have a non-material mind, or some might call it a soul, how do we move those sensations of our material body? How do they reach our soul? How do they reach our mind? And that's also a question that has been asked. And the other major philosopher to be familiar with is Rene Descartes. So we call Descartes' philosophy the Cartesian philosophy. And Descartes, he was in the 1500s, and was posing some important questions that have really shaped Western culture. And according to Descartes, all ideas must come from God, because humans, we're not perfect enough to generate them on our own. So all ideas, all concepts, everything that we know is actually bestowed upon us from God. And Descartes actually believes that we can trust reality because God would not deceive us. Now, it's kind of interesting to understand where Descartes came to this idea. So, um, Descartes went through a process of questioning, of doubting, of saying, okay, this issue that has been discussed over the centuries, how do we know that anything exists? And Descartes kept doubting. He kept saying, well, I don't know. How do I know? Descartes even questioned, is it possible that we are just a figment uh, of a demon's imagination, that our whole existence is actually a demonic fantasy? I know that sounds strange, but we so Descartes and eventually came to this idea is that I know that I exist. And so I know that I can think, I know that I can ask questions, and that I can doubt. And for Descartes, that was the foundation for all other knowledge. Saying, okay, if we go through this line of doubting, 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 well, what is the one thing that I know for sure? Well, it's the fact that I can doubt, the fact that I can think and ask questions. And if I can do that, then I must exist. And that's where you've probably heard the famous line. In Latin, it's cogito ergo sum. In French, it was je pense donc je suis. And in English, you probably know it as I think, therefore I am. So that statement, maybe you've been curious about that statement. It really was this foundation to say, I know things, I can understand things because I uh, I know that I am experiencing my own doubts, my own thoughts, and so that was the foundation for Descartes' philosophy. And Descartes went on from there to say, well, we think that he believed that mind and body were fundamentally different. So mind is, well, body, of course, is physical, but mind is non-physical, immaterial, maybe even supernatural. It didn't exist physically, materially. And so Descartes was the first to really expand upon dualism. He developed this perspective of dualism that says each person is a dual nature. We are a physical body, and then we're also a mind. And the question of, well, how does mind and body communicate, right? How are they connected? Well, Descartes even had an explanation for that. He said the pineal gland. It's a structure in your brain, and it's where he believed communication between mind and body occurred. And where he came from that idea, it's a pretty minor structure in the brain. It's a pretty small structure in the brain, and the only reason why we think he picked it is because it's the only structure in the brain without a duplicate. Meaning, most of our structures in our brain have a left side and a right side, right? So we have different hemispheres, but the pineal gland's right there in the middle, and it doesn't seem to have a left and right side. And so that seems to be why Descartes chose the pineal gland, just thinking it was a unique structure. Okay, but of course this is not the philosophy of learning. This is the psychology of learning. So the problem of mind was not, of course, solved by philosophy, and philosophers continue to debate it. The way that psychologists dealt with this problem was actually pretty radical. Instead of continuing to ask these questions about consciousness and mind, they actually ignored it and said, well, we will never get to an answer about this. So instead, the early psychologists focused on what can we observe, what can we actually measure and interact with. We cannot measure the immaterial, the mind. So let's just focus on the body and focus on our behavior. And so the so let me introduce this idea, psychology and learning. So what is psychology? Of course, it's the study of the psyche, which is the study of the mind, which is a bit of a misnomer because it really is the scientific study of human learning and thinking. And it looks at how experience affects thought and action. It's broad. It also looks at the roles of biology and heredity. It traces how people develop from infants into adults, and it investigates how our behavior is influenced by social interaction. So it tries to explain why people think, act, and feel as they do. All right. I want to have a sort of a reflective question. What do you think of when you hear the word learning? What comes to mind? I'll give you a second to think through that. And I always encourage like free association, right? Free association being whatever comes to mind when you hear the word learning, what images, what words. And so most people, I think, would probably think of schools, education. They would think about knowledge and information. So they would think about things that you would have in your brain, in your mind, and things that you know. Now, I point that out because the way that what we're talking about in this class, it's a bit different from that. The way we think about learning for the psychology of learning is we think about it as a relatively permanent change in potential for behaviors. And it's the change resulting from experience. So learning is about changes in behavior, things that people do, things that we do. And it's actually not as much, there's certainly a role, but it's not ultimately about the knowledge, which is to say, it's not about what's in our head, about what we're thinking, what's going on inside our head. It is actually more about what is expressed through our behavior and our body and our actions. And the reason why we focus on that is because the only way to know learning has occurred is actually through changes in our performance. So if we think about, well, did you learn calculus? We're not asking if the calculus is stored up here. We're actually asking, oh, if I give a person a calculus test, how are they going to perform? How are they? What are their actions going to be on taking that test? And so there's two major elements of that. There's a dispositional element. So your motivation, right? Do you actually want to take a test on calculus? Maybe not. Or if you want to pass your class, then maybe so. And so motivation is an element of it. Are you motivated to do something? Are you motivated to play tennis? Are you motivated to cooking? Do you enjoy cooking? And so there's an element of disposition, and then an element of capability. And capability, of course, is the skills, knowledge, the information that is present in your mind and actually being demonstrated through your performance. And so when we're talking about learning, again, we're not focusing on what's in the head as much as what's going through a person's actions. About that. So what is learning? It was on the last slide, but I want to highlight it here. It's important to know that learning is changes in behavior resulting from experience. So experience, it meaning your life events, contact with, participation in, exposure to external or even internal events. Your own thinking is an experience. And all these events are called stimuli. So the going through being raised by our parents, going through school, learning how to drive, all those kind of things. Those experiences that you had in the world around you are what drive learning. And so what does that exclude? So that includes a lot, but it excludes that we're not talking about changes in your behavior because you're tired. That's not really learning. We're also not talking as much about just the aging process. We're not just saying, oh, well, you are older, now you know this. That's more of a biological process, similar like maturation. Just because your brain has developed more, you might gain some capabilities, but that's not exactly learning, at least as we're talking about in this class. Also, we're not necessarily talking about how your behavior changes when you're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. That's not, again, not what we really think of when we think of learning or injury or disease. And so if someone has a stroke or a brain injury and their behavior changes as a result of that, again, we're not calling that learning. But eventually, again, we are talking about actual or potentially observable changes following experience. Okay. So psychologists who study learning have wanted to know how people's behaviors were formed in order to change the behavior. So in this class, we're going to talk about some perspectives and really some theories so that we can strategically change the behavior of ourselves. So if you have any problematic behaviors, things that you want to change about yourself, the way you act, the way you maybe fail to act, right? We've got problems of procrastination, or maybe failing to exercise, or maybe things like we get afraid in public speaking. Regardless, this class will provide some basic perspectives that will help you strategically change your behavior, but also, right, we learn about this sometimes to help ourselves, but oftentimes to learn how to help others. So how do we help others through their problems? So when we think about this class, it might feel at times that we're kind of scientific and academically oriented, but this can also translate into therapy. It can translate into education and parenting and interacting with your friends. So all of that will be part of the purview of the course. And when I pull myself back from that idea, that's sort of a scientific way of thinking, but when I look at it, I think about this as transformation. That when we're talking about changing behavior, it's really about a transformational process, helping ourselves and others move our lives in the right direction. How do we get rid of problems? How do we increase our good actions and our appropriate actions? And the fact is that people are willing to put themselves in the hands of others to have their lives formed into something better. And we do that in a lot of different ways. So when you go to therapy, you're putting your life in the hands of the therapist to help you think differently, react differently to situations, have better relationships, and moderate your own emotional reactions. And that's a process where we're trying, again, to become someone better. And sorry about that again. We also do that, of course, with education, going to a school. We're seeking out, we want to have a richer view of the world around us, and that's a process. Parenting, all these arenas where we seek out our own and the transformation of others, and ideally it's a positive experience. But I also like, when I think about this, I realize there's another alternative, which is manipulation. So if transformation is the positive, manipulation is the negative. This could be, more nefarious, with the goal of manipulating others to do what we want. Now, some might argue with this, but we know, of course, advertisers will actually use principles from this class, learning theory, and they will use that to make people buy things they otherwise would never buy. So they present things, they classically condition us to connect certain products with certain emotional experiences. They operantly condition us to think, oh, if I buy that, I will be happier. And again, I'm not entirely against advertisement. I think business is a good thing, but I think sometimes we get manipulated by advertisers. Now, another example of this is that people often punish others for being different from themselves, and they hope that they'll conform. So sometimes people are, rude or mean to people, and the goal is like, oh, I want to manipulate them. So of course we don't like manipulation. We don't like that idea. But the lines between transformation, where we're positively trying to help another person grow, and manipulation, where we're trying to make them become something that we want them to be, it's not always clear. And so I hope in the process of this class that we can kind of think through some of those issues. Now, getting back to content from chapter 1. One of the things it talks about in chapter 1 is how do we understand the role of theories in understanding our learning process. So the purpose of theories is, well, first off, a definition. Theories are systematic statements of principles that explain natural phenomena. Now, I point that out because sometimes people think about theories and say, oh, a theory is something that's not been proven. And that's really not how scientists think of theories. Theories are they have to actually have some degree of proof. In science, we never say something is entirely proven. It's just not how scientists talk. Scientists recognize that for every explanation we have of some event, there could always be a better explanation. So, for instance, we know that things like physics. We know, oh, if we have something that moves, we know that we can make predictions about the acceleration based on mass and force, and we thought we understood physics, but then quantum physics came along, quantum mechanics came along, and upended some of our basic physics that we had for centuries, and said, actually, at least for things that are really tiny, the basic laws of physics don't apply. So really weird stuff can occur, like when one particle can exist in two places at the same time, right? That's a weird idea, not anything that was in physics beforehand. So we had a theory of physics that worked really well until it didn't, until we realized that there's some things that traditional physics can't explain. And so, again, when we think about any perspective in psychology, we say, yeah, this is an explanation, it's helpful, but eventually maybe we're going to get to a better explanation. And again, theories, though, have to have some proof. They have to do something. They have to actually explain phenomenon to some degree. So, okay, what are the purposes of theories? Well, it's providing a basis for judging the accuracy and usefulness of beliefs. It helps us simplify and organize observations. It provides a basis for making predictions. And it suggests which facts, which observations are most important, as well as which relationships among these facts are most meaningful. And a theory just can't usually, I mean, some theories are clearly wrong, but typically it can't be evaluated simply in terms of whether it's right or wrong. So George Box, a statistician, said all models are wrong. So you can replace models with theories. All theories are wrong, though some are useful. So every theory that we have in psychology, that we have in science, is wrong to some degree because it's a simplification of reality. But the theories that will persist are the ones that are useful. They help us understand the world around us, and they help us make good predictions. And so that's what ultimately it's about. So one of the things this class will provide you is we're going to talk about different theories, and then we're going to sort of evaluate them. How well does this theory work? And so, okay. All right, and we're going to walk through these questions for every theory that we discuss. Does it reflect the facts? Is it clear and understandable? And there's from philosophy, this idea by a guy named Occam's. Occam's razor is the idea that the simplest explanation is best. Simple is also known as parsimonious. So it's the principle of parsimony. Is it simple and easy for our mind to grasp? If it, with all other things being equal, we want to take the explanation that is simplest. And is it useful for predicting as well as explaining? Is it practically useful? And lastly, is it satisfying? Some theories are so boring that you don't even like them. And so it should be kind of a thought-provoking perspective. And that's what a good theory is. So Kurt Lewin, there's nothing more practical than a good theory, right? So that's not typically how we think of theories. Usually we think of theories as these abstract ideas that don't relate to life around us. But that's not what we're really talking about. A good theory should help us stay grounded, help us, make improvements, do things, understand things, and that's what a good theory should be about. Okay, now switching gears a little bit, just in terms of scientific perspectives. Well, actually, I have this reflection question before I make that transition, and it comes back to this issue of theories, and that's the question: why do people develop addictions? So, if you were to ask 100 people, I don't know how many would respond different ways, but certainly some people would say people develop addictions because they choose to do drugs, or they choose to develop the addiction. So some lay theories of addiction really suggest that people are just making bad moral decisions for their lives. But you've probably heard that addictions are a brain disease. And so that's another perspective, another theory. You could say, well, yeah, addiction is the result of we know it's related to genetics. We know that it's related to poverty and other experiences. And so we know that the brain can react sensitively in some people to drugs and not to other people. And so we can look at brain disease. Or we could say something like self-medication. People are trying to medicate their, bad feelings away. And that some people develop addictions because they continue to try to medicate their bad feelings, and then the addiction creates its own bad feelings, right? Because you feel like you're a slave to the addiction, and then you medicate that bad feeling itself. And so again, just keep thinking about what are your perspectives on addictions. One of the things we're going to talk about in this class is how does learning theory explain addiction? And I think it does a really helpful job with addiction to help us understand why people struggle with drug and alcohol and behavioral addictions like gambling, sex, internet, gaming, all those kind of things. Okay, so now, yeah, here I'm transitioning. So this question: what is science? And I asked this question because this class is very much scientifically oriented. So it helps to take a step back and ask this question. So science is what's a collection of information, right? It's a scientific knowledge base. It's also a way of dealing with information. It's a method. It's a way of gathering information. And science actually is psychology's tool for separating fact from fiction. So psychology at times has sometimes had these debates, and it actually is a little bit more philosophical, where you know people like Freud and Jung, they had these debates about what is the human psyche and um, how do we understand the way people behave. And we don't do that anymore. We don't just debate and rhetorically have these arguments. We now look for evidence. And so uh, contemporary psychology would turn to science as a method for separating uh, fact beliefs from fictional beliefs. And just kind of a refresher on the scientific method. It's a straightforward process where you ask a question, you develop a hypothesis, your own prediction about your own answer to the question, right? You don't you think you know the answer to your own question, but you don't actually just trust your own answer. So you collect relevant observations, you collect data, and with the data, you test your hypothesis. So this is where statistics would come into play. You analyze the data to say, well, does it fit with my hypothesis? And then finally, you reach and share a conclusion. And yeah, and this is the process that we're going to go through for each of the sections of this class. Is we're going to apply the scientific method to different questions. And chapter 1, we also talk about some other things. I want to cover it real quickly because we are, in some of the experiments, we're going to talk about knowledge gained from studies with animals. And it's important to kind of touch on why do we study animals when we're trying to understand psychology. Well, there's a few advantages. So many of the procedures used in psychology, at least in early psychology, couldn't ethically be performed with humans. So you can't hold a human in a cage and study the human's behavior, but you can do that with an animal. And so an animal's experiences can be very carefully controlled, and we just can't do that with human subjects. And what we've found, and this is not, I'm not suggesting that we always conclude this, but generally, animal studies can be generalized to humans. That the principles that we see in animals can actually translate into human behavior and human psychology. Now, I know what you're thinking, or some of you may be thinking, well, humans are different, and that actually is an important process in science, that we test something with animals, but we don't actually just believe it's true in humans blindly. We also do a similar experiment, again, not with as much control, but we verify. And generally what we found is that animal research has been very informative to human experience and human psychology. That's not to say that it's always a perfect translation. We know that some animals are better than others, right? Rats, strangely enough, the behavior of rats translates well to humans, but there's reasons why we don't use other animals. And so, yeah, so we do use animals in some of the research, but of course, generally we try to use human subjects. Now, what are the limitations of science? Science cannot answer all questions. First off, replication is the foundation of science. So science is only going to be able to answer questions that can be replicated. So science cannot answer historical questions. Why? We cannot repeat history. Even though there may be cycles of history that does repeat itself, we cannot go back to the Gettysburg Address and replicate that and say, oh well, what can we learn about it from a scientific perspective? No, we just have to go back and kind of do a historical record. That's why we need history, and we don't just science cannot answer those questions. So what can science tell us about? Science can tell us about events that are replicable in general. So we call this nomothetic truth, just a term that's been used to say things that are general to all people, and general patterns, and of course replicable patterns. But of course science cannot. And as much as I appreciate science, I also know that science has certain limits. So science cannot tell us about events that are unique, individual. We call those idiographic truths. So it cannot tell you about your life experiences that are unique. It may say certain things. If you go through a trauma, it is likely that you're going to have certain ramifications of it, but it cannot actually predict individually, uniquely, at least in entirety, how you will react to a trauma and how your unique experience of that trauma unfolded. So it's important to remember that. Okay. Now, I'm going to move away from the chapter topic a little bit, because I think there's some additional information that I like to go over. And that is, in theology, there is a distinction that is made between general revelation and special revelation. And general revelation is truth revealed to all people through creation. Special revelation is truth revealed to those who are witnesses of God's inbreaking in history, or it's really it's revealed to those who are believers, who are Christian followers of Christ, followers of God's Spirit. And so special revelation, the best example of special revelation is Scripture. So Scripture is revealed to those who are believers, and we learn from Scripture, we learn truth from Scripture, and we learn certain important historical facts, historical events, like Christ's death on the cross. We learn about God's work to restore His relationship with humanity, and so there's certain things that is special. Now, there's a few other things like prophecies and things like that fit into this category. But I want to talk a little bit more about general revelation, because general revelation is that the reality that all people, regardless of their faith status, are able to understand some truth. In Romans 1, it talks about God making it apparent to all creation, to all humans, through creation, that He basically that He created the world. And so Paul writes in Romans 1 that all people know that God is the creator. And well, how do they know that? It's because they look around at the world and they gather some truth. And so there's this idea that it doesn't matter if you are a believer or not, some truth is revealed to all people through creation. So science, you could think of it as a means by which God is revealing Himself to all people. It is a form of general revelation. So I think that science can certainly tell us some truth that, again, it's available to all people, but it is still truth. It can be known in ways that you have to personally experience, and it's not given to us through Scripture or through prophecy. And another thing I like to cover for this class is the idea of history. And I do this because this class is sort of historically organized. It's a little bit of the history of psychology. And I think it helps to step back and understand the big picture of history. So you can broadly divide up human history into three stages: pre-modern, modern, and the stage that we're in currently, postmodern. And science was developed so that we can move from pre-modern ways of thinking into modern ways of thinking. So let me give you an outline of that. The pre-modern was prior to 1500 AD, roughly. I just use that as a sort of, it's not a particular date, it's more of a way of thinking, but that kind of works, right? So about the time of the Renaissance, about the time when Christopher Columbus kind of expanded people's views of what the world is, shortly after the printing press. Those were some of the key historical events. Before all that, in general, people would view reality in a spiritual manner. They would view reality as infused with life, meaning, spirituality. And when they thought about truth, they thought truth was subjective. They sort of emotionally, intuitively knew truth. If it felt right, they thought it was truth. It was, in a way, based on faith. There was no real way to know if you were correct or not. And so people would argue and fight, and there'd be lots of violence because one tribal leader would say, I have a right to this land. Another tribal leader would say, no, it's our land. And again, they would fight because they had that disagreement. But they would believe certain things because of that emotional, intuitive way of thinking. And so in this time, superstitions were very all over the place. There was lots of hierarchies, lots of violence, and it was all because truth belonged to the powerful. And so that is a little bit of the pre-modern stage. And then again, there's no clear starting point for modernity, but again, Gutenberg Press, the Christopher Columbus, and maybe even Descartes. Descartes really added to this not scientific, but philosophical perspective, where reality should be approached with objectivity, logic, and reason. Again, Descartes abandoned this idea, oh, it's all just demonic imagination. He came back to this idea, no, we can know the world because God gives us this ability to reason, to logic, to, that God wouldn't deceive us. And so in this time period, they started discarding some of the superstitions. They started making technological advancement, cultural advancement with our arts and things like that. And a lot of it was based on this presumption that the universe is lawful. It is acting according to the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics. There's this idea of objectivity is the ultimate good. We want to be free of our biases and preconceptions and view the world as it really is. And some of the consequences of that is that in this time, humanity was really distinguished from the rest of the world. So in this time, humans were the conquerors of the primitive world, the capricious world and again, part of this was actually a bit of the imperialistic mindset of the Western world that said, we're going to go conquer these other cultures and bring civilization to them. And of course, there's some awful ramifications of that, people being killed and forcing change upon people. So there's cultural shifts, but also there's this idea that everything could be predicted and measured, that everything could be scientifically studied. So in this period, the modern period, that's when the scientific method really started to come about. And again, there's these contrasts between pre-modern and modern thinking. So although I'm connecting it to time, the thing is, in today's world, there's still people who are pre-modern thinkers, pre-modern in terms of their um, uh, view of the world. So in pre-modern culture, the known, the objects, was often a projection of the knower. Okay, if I if there was something around me, whatever I wanted that thing to be, if it's a rabbit's foot, that's a lucky charm. Um, it's a external representation of an internal experience. So people believed what they wanted to believe. They weren't really accountable to evidence. They just believed whatever they thought was true. Again, I think there are some people like this today. And the knower and the known were completely interconnected. Now, in modern culture, the knower and the known became completely distinct and alienated. So in modern thinking, you were trying to distinguish yourself. You didn't want to be biased. You didn't want to have any. So you'd be objective, and objective says, you know, I don't have any relationship with this. I'm simply studying it. And so objectivity allowed for the study of things without being influenced by our desires. So that's had some good. It allowed us to do hypothesis testing. And even our process of knowing was an object of study, right? So we have this class where we studied the process of knowing. And now, in postmodern culture, which is where we're at in our culture today, we realize that we always approach knowledge from a vantage point. We are shaped by what we have experienced. And this is really forced upon us because we have realized that objectivity is actually impossible. We are always subjects. We are always people. And as a result of the fact that we are people, we are always subject to our, biases. So I think science has revealed that human beings, even at our best, are always biased and prejudiced, and our minds are always in our brains are always at play, and so we are always interacting with things from a personal perspective. So this is a mouse. I cannot objectively look at this mouse and just study it. Why? Because I am inherently going to think about this as, oh, this is a tool for navigating my computer. I cannot escape that. I cannot simply view this as from an objective perspective. And that's really the heart of postmodernity, recognizing that objectivity is impossible. So truth is always, undistorted truth. Objective truth, where we know things from a completely objective perspective, is always a little bit out of reach. And so in postmodernity, what we've realized is science is useful and helpful, but it has its flaws. Now, if you've heard about postmodernity, maybe you've heard of other concerns or questions, I kind of invite you to share about any questions or comments you have about postmodernity in the discussion forum. But I think this idea that we realize that human beings were always, we have our limits. For me, that's the important conclusion of postmodernity that the modern age really didn't appreciate. That the modern age thought, oh, science is going to allow us to conquer the world. Everything's going to be solved by science, and we're always going to get better. Where we realize, science sometimes creates horrific weapons. Sometimes it, is used for conquering people and harming people. And so we realize, there's some flaws to science. Okay, so last for this video, just a preview of what is the text, the textbook going to cover. So we have just finished chapter 1, chapters 2, 3, and 4. So chapter 2, we're going to talk about behaviorism. This is a real key to this, this topic, understanding behaviorism, and we're going to start off with Pavlov. You've probably heard of Pavlov, Watson, and Guthrie. And then chapter 3, we're going to focus on the effects of behavior. This is all about operant, well, it's starting to get into operant conditioning. We're going to talk about Thorndike and Hull. And then chapter 4, we're going to talk about true operant conditioning, and that's where Skinner comes into play, B.F. Skinner. Then in chapters 5, 6, 7, well, chapter 5, we're going to talk about evolution and how has evolution, what has it taught us about psychology. We're going to talk about biology and learning, and just touch on the role of the brain in the learning process. Then we're going to shift to chapter 6, where we're going to say, well, what is the modern cognitivist perspective? Talk about Donald Hebb, Tolman, and the Gestaltists. And then we're going to cover 3 cognitive theories by Jerome Bruner, Jean Piaget, and Vygotsky. And then we're going to we're going to skip 8, 9, and 10. And we're going to jump to chapters 11, which is, chapter 11 is on social learning, and that's Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory. And then chapter 12 is just kind of a brief chapter putting things together, a synthesis, an integration of what we've learned. Okay. So, yeah, the last thing that we're going to do, and we do this in every chapter, we're going to apply learning theory. We're not going to just learn about the content. We're going to think, well, how does this apply to the real world? So again, learning theories are trying to explain changes in behavior as a result of experience. So good learning theories will allow us to explain behavior, predict behavior, and maybe even, if we intervene, control behavior. And ideally, again, that's transformational control, not manipulative control. Of course, changing behavior is a business of education, parenting, therapy, sales. A lot of human life is trying to change people's behaviors. And so you will, I want you to constantly be reflecting as you're reading, as you're hearing these videos or watching these videos. Does this theory suggest a way of intervening, a method for making a change? Would it be effective? Is it possible that the theory is too reductionist? Meaning, does it try to simplify things beyond what's, the world itself? Life is complex. Is it trying to make it too simple? And lastly, is the problem not properly defined by the theory? Do we have problems that we have a theory, but the theory doesn't really capture the whole scope of a particular problem? So yeah, I think this is the last slide, and it's a good place for us to stop. Again, as you're watching this, I hope that you can consider your goals for this course. If you realize that this course has ramifications for your professional life, well, what ramifications would you like to have? What would you like to accomplish, experience, achieve through this course? And how will you know if you have met that goal? So again, and invite you to reflect on some of your goals and hopes for this course in the discussion for the week. All right, that's it for this chapter. I look forward to jumping into chapter 2 and interacting with you guys on the discussion forums. And yeah, hope you have a great week. Okay, bye.